Hey, how's it going? My name's Andy Monroe and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about what I think is the most important part of every single event and what I also think is the most neglected part of every single event, and that is registration. Whether it's a corporate event, a workshop, a summit, a retreat, a concert, a wedding, whatever it is, in my opinion, registration is the most important touch point of any event, and I'm going to dive into why right now. So why do I think that registration is the most important part of every single event? The first reason why is that registration is going to be the first impression that an attendee has at your event. It's going to be their first touch point. It's going to be the first time they're interacting with the event, with your team, with the staff, with the people, the other attendees. And it's really going to set the event off on a high note or a low note. If your attendee has a great registration experience, they have a nice conversation with the staff, they get all of their questions answered, they get their merchandise, they move right along, it was easy to find. They're going to start off on a really high note, and it's really going to set them up for success to have a great experience at your event. However, on the other end, if they have a poor experience at registration, maybe they stand in line forever, maybe one of the staff members was rude to them, maybe they couldn't find it, maybe they didn't get all their questions answered, whatever it was, if they have a bad experience at registration, it's going to set their entire experience off on a low note. And yes, you can win that back. Maybe your event is still amazing and they have a great time, but you still have to work to build that relationship with the attendee again, when you could just optimize your registration process and set them off on a high note from the get-go. Now, I've been to plenty of events where the registration process was awful and I still had a great time. That being said, I'm telling you about it right now on camera. I remember all the events where I had a really bad experience at registration, and that kind of sticks with you. Whenever I tell somebody about a certain concert or event that I've been to, I'll usually say, like, yeah, it was really good, but if I had a bad experience at registration, I always bring that up because it's still stuck in my mind. It's like an anchor. It's what I associate that brand with. I'm like, yeah, the event was great, but the registration sucked, so they had no idea what they were doing. And this is what attendees will do at your event as well, so make sure you are focusing and taking the time to optimize your registration process. The next reason why registration is the most important part of every single event is because it can very easily go wrong. Registration can very easily go wrong. It's easy to create an experience at registration that is not very pleasant for attendees. And to make things worse, in my opinion, it's actually hard to create a good experience at registration as well. You have to put the time and effort into actually thinking through the entire process and thinking through the entire experience. And there's so many different variables going on at once that it's actually hard to create a good registration process. And that's why I think that most events and most concerts and most experiences don't have the best registration process. It's because they don't dedicate the time to making it a good experience. And when I say it's easy for things to go wrong, it's easy for long lines to form. It's easy for an attendee to get confused. It's easy for a staff member to forget to communicate all the information to the attendees so that they're confused. They don't know where session is. Or they don't know where the food is. It's easy for anger and frustration to spread throughout the crowd because everybody's all there and conglomerated at the registration area. That's why I think registration is so important, because it's so hard to nail and it's very easy to mess up. So you really need to take the time and focus a lot of effort into making sure it's a good experience for your attendees. Another reason why registration is so important is because it's actually the only time that you'll have direct contact with your attendees. Prior to the event and actually at the event itself, yes, you'll be communicating with your attendees through various apps or maybe emails or maybe intercoms or an announcement on stage, whatever it is. You'll be communicating with them, but they're always going to be occupied and not fully engaged. However, at registration, that's the one time where you get to talk to an attendee one-on-one and communicate all of the information that you want to communicate to them and make sure that they start their experience off on a high note. And if you don't take advantage of that, it could come back and bite you. So if there's anything that you want to communicate with your attendees, if there's any answers to their questions that you want to provide, if there's any resources you want to give your attendees, make sure you are taking full advantage of the registration process and that one-on-one time that you get with them before the event starts. All right, the last reason why I think that registration is such an important part of every single event is because it's a great spot to collect some data. Now, when I plan my events, I like to make data-driven decisions. I like to read surveys and make decisions and change my events based off of survey data that I have received. And at the same time, I do like to curate my events and create them around some of the data that I collected at registration. At the registration desk, the data that I like to collect is stuff that is future looking, stuff that's kind of positive and that they're looking forward to, or what was like their inspiration for coming to the event. It's kind of hard to have them reflect on the event or the experience when they just got there. So I'll have my staff ask questions like, what brought you to this event? Where are you flying in from? How did you discover this event, this brand, this company? company, whatever it is. What are you looking forward to learning about? What problem do you want solved? And these are actually very valuable questions and very, very valuable answers to have, because if a lot of attendees have the same problems or they have the same questions or whatever it is, you can start to curate your events in the future using that information. So I definitely recommend using registration as a great place to collect some data. All right, now that I have covered why I think registration is so important, I'm going to provide you with a few methods to optimize your registration process and make sure it's a great experience for your attendees. The first method that I want to talk about is to simply just spend a lot of time on the registration design. Now, this isn't something that I started doing right when I started planning events. I would kind of just assume that registration would figure itself out. And I think that's what a lot of event planners do. But the second I started to invest a lot of time and energy into the actual design of registration, that's when I started to see a very vast difference between a good registration and a bad registration. And when I mean the registration design, I mean the entire flow of the experience of the attendee going through registration. You know, where does the line start? Where is the line going to extend into? Is it going to cross any hallways? Is it going to block any doors? Are different registrations going to conflict with each other? Is the GA too close to the VIP? Or is the GA and the VIP lines going to connect to each other? Is there clear signage that's going to guide the attendee through the experience? All these questions are things that you need to ask when you're coming up with a registration process. Because like I said, it's hard to nail a good registration process, but if you don't do any of this, if you don't prepare and you don't dedicate the time to your registration, it can very easily go wrong. And it's going to start a lot of your attendees off on a low note. The next method I want to talk about, which is something I just hinted at, but that is actually having some directional branding to help your attendee kind of get guided through the experience. One lesson that a mentor taught me is that you want the entire experience of your event for every attendee to just be a flow. You know, the flow state that you enter, maybe when you're on a run or you're doing some deep work, there's a very effortless action that's happening and you're kind of being guided through the experience instead of having to will yourself through it. And that's what you want your event to be like for your attendee, including registration. And not just any directional branding, but very good and optimized directional branding that will really help your attendee kind of get guided through your experience. A few examples of directional branding that I use for registration specifically. The first one is standing banners. These are really good. However, they can be blocked pretty easily by attendees. You know, most standing banners are between 6 to 7 feet tall. And, you know, if there's somebody that's 6 foot tall right in front of you, that can get blocked pretty easily. So I also like to leverage some floor graphics. And the last kind that I like to use are just like any kind of elevated branding. That way, with these three, you can kind of hit them at all different points of view. You know, if there's a big crowd in front of them and they can't see the standing banners and the floor graphics, they can look up and see the elevated branding. Maybe it's somebody who just likes to stare at the floor when they walk. They can see the floor graphics. Actually, the last one I'll say for branding is actually staff. For registration specifically, I like to scatter my staff throughout the event venue so that if somebody's lost or they have a question to ask, they can just walk up to one of the staff. Or if somebody's just walking and they're not even really thinking about it, the staff can kind of be like, hey, what's up? Like, nice to meet you. My name's blank. I'm from the event. Registration is this way. Wait, what ticket type are you? Oh, you're VIP. So it's going to be on the left side instead of the right. They can kind of answer those questions before the attendee has to ask them, which is a great way to set up the entire experience for success. All right, moving on to number 3. The third way to optimize your registration process is just to properly communicate with your attendee. Now, if you're in the event space, you can understand how hard communication can be. You just need to over communicate with your attendees about everything in regard to your event. And we have a kind of like this inside joke inside of my events team, but we like to communicate. We like to over communicate with the attendees. And we also like to communicate with them like they're 5 years old. It's like, what would a 5-year-old need to still have a good experience at our event? And you have to tell them every single thing about the entire event, like not only where the event is, like the event venue, but exactly where it's going to be inside of the conference center. And you need to let them know to like walk in the door and look up and they'll see a sign, and that sign's going to point them in the direction of the event. Then you turn right to where the arrow is pointing and you walk down the hallway, then you'll see another sign. And you actually have to over communicate this stuff because attendees will just mindlessly walk through an experience, and if it's not just the most frictionless, flow-like experience ever, they're gonna have some sort of complaint. And you, as the event planner, are going to get really frustrated if you have people complaining about your registration process. It's super annoying, and it's not a great way for you to start the event off, let alone the attendee. So just make sure you're over communicating, and also communicate through different mediums. I'm sure you're going to have some sort of event app or event communication platform for your event. So communicate through that, communicate through email, send texts if you can, and also give them physical handouts at registration so that they have all the information with them as well. If you can hit all of your attendees through a bunch of different mediums while also over communicating and doing it in a way that a fifth grader, and also doing it in a way that a 5-year-old would understand, you should set yourself up for success. The next method that I want to talk about is to train your staff. Now this one, I'm gonna highlight that a lot because training your staff is really important. I have a pretty big team that runs my larger conferences, and there's only a select few that I will have run registration just because they are the ones that I can trust with the registration process. You want your staff at registration to be high energy, to be excited, to be welcoming, but you also want them to be trained on how to answer questions and how to give them all the information that they might need as they're checking in. If you have a staff member who's low energy or kind of mean, or they just do or they're just checking the boxes like, hey, how's it going? Welcome in. Here's your lanyard. Get on with it. That's not going to necessarily set somebody up for failure to have a bad experience at your event, but it's not really going to set them up on that high note to really catapult them to have a good experience. So make sure you are selecting people that are very high energy, that are going to be welcoming to the attendee, and also you as the event planner, you need to train them to make sure they have all of the information needed to answer any questions that the attendees are going to ask them. Because if an attendee can't get a question answered at the registration desk, like that's like the hub of the first day of the event, then where are they going to go to get their questions answered? That's, it kind of downgrades the quality of your event because the attendee's now like, oh wow, even the staff doesn't know the answer to this question. So how am I supposed to have a good experience and, navigate this experience and navigate this event without having a bunch of questions? So just make sure your staff is properly trained. All right, moving on to number 6. The 6th method that you can use to optimize your registration process is to make it quick, but also effective. Now this is pretty important. You want registration to be quick. You want it to be a kind of a seamless, fluid experience for the attendee, but you also want to make it effective. Kind of going back to one of the points I said earlier, you want to communicate all of the proper information, all the necessary information to your attendee when you have that one-on-one time. You want to give them everything they need and answer all their questions while also making it a quick and seamless experience. So this is really just a balance. It's a really big balance. There was one event where I made a huge mistake, and that was having a QR code be at the registration desk where somebody they scan a QR code and that's how they registered. However, we didn't purchase Wi-Fi to have that QR code be functional. So people were sitting there, they would scan the QR code and they'd have to wait like 2 or 3 minutes for the screen to load. And then they would get on there and they would fill out all the registration information, and then it would they'd hit submit and it would take a little bit to go through on our end. So it really backed things up and there was a massive line going through the hallway and people were pretty upset. So I'm not a huge fan of having anything that attendees have to scan on their phones. Even if you have Wi-Fi, just let them come up to you or have them come up to a kiosk and handle everything right there. If you put too much responsibility on the attendee, they're going to mess it up somehow and it's going to slow things down. So just keep it in your hands, make sure that you can control it, and find a way to balance between having it be a quick and seamless process but also being effective. Now, I didn't add this one to the list prior, but since I just said it, I'm going to add it right now. And that's actually to just buy Wi-Fi. I've had registrations where I bought Wi-Fi for it, and I've had registrations where I didn't buy Wi-Fi. And it seems like every time I don't buy Wi-Fi for registration, I just need it at some point. We need to export a list, or we need to do a quick Google search. We need to do something that requires the internet, and it doesn't really work, and everyone starts to freak out. So we have to use a hotspot, and people are using up their cellular data, and it's just a pretty bad experience for the attendee and for the staff. So just be safe, spend the money on Wi-Fi. It's going to be worth it, and it's going to save you a lot of headaches. All right, I got a few more for you. The next one that I want to talk about is to have some sort of early registration at some point at your event. Now, I usually like to do my early registration the evening before day one, and I'll usually pair it up with some sort of cocktail hour or some sort of networking function so the attendees can come to early registration and there's an incentive to show up, and then they can go and they can meet the attendees, and they come into the actual day one already knowing people and already having some sort of experience with the event. I've just found that really elevates the vibes and the energy of the events going into day one when you already have some sort of successful function going on day 0. But ever since I started implementing the early registration plus a networking function the day before the event, I usually register about 25 to 30% of the people before the event even gets started, which is a huge help on day one because, as you know, If you're doing registration on day one, you have 1,000 people coming through within the matter of a couple hours, it can get very stressful. So I try to check in as many people as possible in that early registration. Now, the last point that I want to mention for having a successful registration process kind of builds off of having early registration, and that is just having some sort of late registration option. Now, in a perfect world, everybody shows up to your event on time, and they go through registration, and they're in the seats, and they're interacting and experiencing the event all together. However, there's going to be people that show up late. There's going to be people that miss registration, and it's very frustrating for them and yourself if you don't really have a process set up for that. So even if it's just one small table that doubles as a help desk, just make sure you have some sort of late registration open throughout the entire event so that the stragglers that come in have a place to go and the attendees at the event have a place to go and have their questions answered. That'll just make the experience a lot better for everybody involved. All right, so those are kind of 9 ways that I use to make sure that my registration process is as good as possible for my attendees. I hope this was helpful for you. Hopefully you can use some of these strategies for your events and they help make your registration better. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down below. I would love to hear them and answer them. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.